Hello, I'm your host, Brian Callanan. A sobering economic report shows Seattle is facing a budget deficit of more than $240 million over the next 2 years. That includes possible cuts in federal funding as the White House targets welcoming cities like Seattle across the country. I'm talking with Councilmember Dan Strauss, the Council's Budget Committee Chair, plus Alexis Mercedes Rinck, the Council member who's heading up a committee focused on federal policy changes, to see what kinds of cuts and new revenue proposals might be on the table. We're answering viewer questions too, next on City Inside Out, Council Edition.
I am horrified by the findings of this, and I'll be taking every possible step I can to be providing that oversight and accountability because this cannot continue.
When property tax is capped at 1%, that means that the revenue coming into the city is not meeting the same rate as inflation.
All that and more coming up next on City Inside Out, Council Edition. Welcome back to City Inside Out, Council Edition. I'm Brian Callanan. Glad you're here with us on the Seattle channel, and I'm very glad to be hosting two council members at the center of some major policy issues right now. That would include Alexis Mercedes Rinck, Seattle's Position 8 citywide council member. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Also with us, Councilmember Dan Strauss, who represents District 6 in Northwest Seattle. Councilmember Strauss, good to be with you too.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm going to start with you, Councilmember Strauss, if I could, because you're also the chair of the Council's Budget Committee, which has received some pretty tough news this month. We have some international issues like tariffs clouding the economic picture. We have some weak job growth locally, and Seattle has a decline in projected revenues from several taxes, including the payroll expense tax on big businesses, known as Jumpstart. It adds up to a budget deficit for the city of more than $240 million over the next 2 years. So recently, Jan Duras, the interim director of Seattle's Office of Economic and Revenue Forecast, the city's chief economist, described a financial situation with a lot of uncertainty.
What we expect is the uncertainty to linger on, and that uncertainty then leads to overall lower spending by consumers who might be worried about the future. Lower business sentiment would lead to less investment, less hiring. It's hard to make longer-term plans since there is just an incredible amount of uncertainty.
Councilmember Strauss, this is the first time, as I understand it, since the pandemic era of 2020 that the city has taken on a pessimistic revenue outlook here. I want to talk about the big budget picture, if I can, for the city right now. And I'm sure you're hearing this. Where are you going to make cuts? What are you talking about with progressive revenue, possibly? Let's dive into it, please.
Yeah, so this is the very similar thing that I said in October when we had a downturn forecast for the first time since the pandemic years of 2020. Beyond that, for both a downturn forecast, which means when we received the mayor's budget in September, there were fewer dollars available to us by November to put into that budget. And so we had to, for the first time, look at the entire budget overall in a way that we hadn't since the pandemic. But that was during the pandemic, it was a little bit more of a short-term situation because the downturn forecast and the pessimistic outlook were both short-term. And then we were able to stabilize pretty quickly, come back to where we are today. Okay. What this shows you today, though, is that the downturn economic situation that is still kind of trickling along from the pandemic, we're still in the middle of it. And so I've tried to say this every single year for the past number of years. We're not out of the woods yet. And this is another indication. Before 2020, the last time that we had either a downturn forecast mid-budget or a pessimistic outlook was in the 2008 recession. And so I can't more loudly say we're in a bad position right now. And there's a number of things that this is coming from. Last year we had a structural budget hole that we had to work on that was not economically related, right? What this was a product of is Seattle experienced 10 years of high growth. We can all remember what the skyline looked like in 2010.
Sure.
There were maybe a quarter of the buildings built.
Okay.
As we have today. The city of Seattle received revenue, both in sales tax from construction, but also increased property tax. That allowed us to build a larger budget than just based on one-time funds. We've continued funding those programs. Last year, we did do a gut check where we had to scale back some, but for the most part, we were able to to continue meeting the needs of Seattleites on the programs and projects that they want and rely on.
Okay.
Here we are today. We have a downturn and a pessimistic forecast outlook. The reason that we, and Director Duras indicated that we should take the pessimistic view at this forecast, let's dig into this.
Okay.
To build the forecast takes about 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks was when tariffs were announced. And then we had the forecast, and then after the forecast, the tariffs were repealed.
Paused, right.
Or paused.
Yeah.
Right? And so I can't focus in enough that it was literally the week before, and once Director Duras had run his numbers, then the numbers changed. And then they were presented, and then the numbers changed again. It is critical that in this time of economic fluctuation, what we saw in his presentation is that the volatility index is very high right now. What that means is that we're in an uncertain time. The things that happened last week may not be true next week. For everything else, we should be taking a pessimistic outlook on this forecast. Okay. The good news is, between now and the mayor crafting their budget or the council taking up our budget, we will have 2 additional forecasts. Hopefully, we will have a smoother economic situation. Things will stabilize, whether good or bad, because having volatility and instability is what is causing the most kind of headache and heartache here, because we're talking about potentialities that we don't know to be true.
Okay, got it.
So we've got 2 more forecasts, one before the mayor's proposed budget, and then one before the council approves our budget.
Yeah.
We don't know what they're going to hold, but what I'll tell you is it goes back to, over the last decade, we expanded our budget because our city was growing. Over the last 4 years, we've seen our economy stagnating and at times shrinking. So we know that we're going to have to make more adjustments. We ran a very good process last year to preserve as much as we could of what the city is doing today.
Okay.
And that's a process that I hope to engage in again this year.
Okay.
I see you've got more questions.
Yeah,
I've got more to say.
No, I know. I appreciate that breakdown there of the big picture. I did want to move on to another piece of this, and Councilmember Rinck, maybe I can bring you in, because you've indicated recently that you're going to be pushing for some new revenue to be coming in, possibly some new taxes in the city's upcoming budget process. I want to talk about that. I want to offer a few different comments on that approach. One writer says this: Seattle has an $8 billion plus budget, and they still can't balance it without a deficit. Tax revenue isn't the problem, it's government spending. Another says, what are you confused about? We need to tax the rich. I just wanted to talk about this and your ideas for new revenue.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think I've been on record as really wanting to make sure that we have corporations and the ultra-wealthy in our community pay their fair share to ensure that we can deliver on critical community services. And that's certainly something that I'm thinking about during this time. And I think it's also worth noting that Seattle's not alone in our budget challenges. The county is also struggling with a millions of dollars shortfall. The state is struggling with, what is it, $16 billion across 4 years. And it's looking more and more likely every day that the legislature is going to be moving into special session as they're trying to reconcile that. So Seattle's not alone. We have a structural challenge. We know in Washington State we have a tremendously regressive tax code. Recently, a UW professor from the Evans School, Jacob Vigder, cited that our tax code system is akin to the Cayman Islands. And we continue to see that working families, the bottom 60% of Washingtonians, pay 13.8% of their income into taxes, whereas the top 1% of Washingtonians pay 4.1%.
Okay.
So we have structural challenges. And we know that our communities need investment. And so as we're looking to grapple with our own budget deficit within the city, we should have all options on the table, particularly options that do not put more of a disproportionate burden on working families.
Got it. Is that a capital gains tax, or what do you think?
All options definitely need to be on the table, whether it be local capital gains, re-examining Jumpstart, or other tax options that are available and have been studied. We had the Revenue Stabilization Task Force that met just a couple years back and identified some options to be able to address this challenge. You know, they saw that this challenge was on the horizon, and so I think it's certainly worth revisiting that report. I know my team is, and we're trying to develop some options to be able to address this.
Okay. Councilmember Strauss, some ideas here about new taxes, new revenue. Is that on the table for you? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, I think Councilmember Rinck took a statement that I oftentimes say, which is all options are always on the table.
Okay.
Right? We have a big budget shortfall. We have declining revenues based on our economy that's stagnating at the moment. How are we going to move forward? And for me, I look at, we've raised progressive revenue in the city of Seattle 3 out of the last 5 years. It's, that is real. And I'm a proud original co-sponsor of the Jumpstart legislation. People did not necessarily think highly of it. That legislation was vetoed, and we had to override or veto. And we're today relying on it in our budget so heavily that when it had, and I'll go back to the forecast, sorry to talk about this a little bit, that, there was a downturn in the Jumpstart forecast of revenue received last year, and that's part of this pessimistic outlook. That is in part due to the fact that we've only collected revenue for 3 or 4 years now. And anyone in economics will tell you, you need 5-year smoothing to really get more accurate trends.
Okay. And you don't see that as an indication that businesses are moving jobs out? I know I've heard that criticism before.
I've heard anecdotally that as well, but I've also heard, nonfiction that that these businesses are requiring their people to come back into the office. So whether they've moved their workstations or not is a little bit anecdotal because people have been working from home. Now, have businesses been tracking how much they're working at home versus in the office? These are all of the known unknowns that create noise when we're having these conversations. Because we need to have 5-year smoothing so that we can have forecasts that we can rely on. There's no, I'm not throwing shade at Director Duras in any way. It's just the fact that we've only had 3 or 4 years of data.
Okay. That's an important, please.
Yeah, and if I may just add a point to this, I know we're talking specifically about the city's budget, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we're seeing federal dollars dry up in our community.
I did want to talk about this. You're overseeing this committee that looks at different changes in federal policy. Let's break this down, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So while the city is grappling with our own deficit, it's important to note that many organizations that serve our residents have been receiving federal grants for some time. These are things that wouldn't be captured necessarily by our city budget, but rather, again, these are resources within our community. So when we look at things like, this is something that we've been exploring in the Federal Administration and Policy Change Committee. We had a recent panel focused on housing, looking at the spectrum of affordable housing development with having folks that work in the low-income housing tax credit program at the table, all the way to King County Regional Homelessness Authority, talking about federal funds that go directly towards homelessness response, but also organizations like Chief Seattle Club and Downtown Emergency Services Center. Wanted to highlight DESC in particular because their model relies on Medicaid reimbursement, for example. And it was unearthed in that committee that 1/4 of their budget comes from Medicaid reimbursement. That's $35 million that supports some of our most vulnerable community members. So that would certainly, should that go away, that's a huge loss to our community and something that I think a number of our community organizations would look to the city to help develop a plan for what's our plan to backfill, especially when we're talking about an organization, again, serving some of our most vulnerable residents and looking at a reality where if we don't backfill or come up with some solution, those folks might need to go to the streets again.
And I'll take it one step further, which is that homelessness, as an example, education is another one.
Where federal cuts are having an impact,
And at the end of the day, these are state issues that haven't been dealt with, and so the city of Seattle has stepped up to address. Homelessness, I didn't see necessarily addressed by the state until it was on the freeways outside of Olympia. And then we had the right-of-way program that has really good results because it's a well-built program based upon work that we've done here in the city. And still, I'm now worried that we'll receive cuts to the state's work. But at the end of the day, I have to bring this up, that the city of Seattle funds so many things that are outside of what our core services should be. And we do so because it's our responsibility to Seattleites. So I'm talking about education. I'm talking about
with the levy, the FEP levy,
Well, but I mean, we're one of the only cities, if not the only city in the state, that provides city funding to the school district within our jurisdiction. This is because the state is not funding education at the level it should be. We're funding, Seattle being the largest city in the state and the largest county in the state, we're taking on homelessness work that is a statewide issue. I mean, we can just keep going down the list, and this is not to be finger pointing at the state, rather to say that in the times in the past when the federal or state government has not fulfilled their full duty, the city of Seattle steps in because we know Seattleites expect world-class services.
Right. Let me keep going down that path with regard to the state, because both of you signed an open letter to the governor and the state legislature calling for more progressive revenue options and also some increased local authority over taxation as well. You were the only two Seattle council members who signed on to this. Nearly 70 lawmakers across the state offered their signatures. I wanted to ask this to you, Councilmember Rinck. We're recording this program just a few days before the legislature is supposed to wrap up its session here. We'll see how that goes. But what message are you trying to get through to the state? Why was it important to you to sign that letter?
Yeah, certainly. Well, as Councilmember Strauss was saying, we've historically seen the state underinvest in a number of critical services. And so for me, in signing that letter, I'm looking at, again, a $16 billion deficit that, if unaddressed, would also continue to have devastating impacts across the state and for our residents. And so
over the next 4 years.
Over the next 4 years,
right.
Correct. And so for me, signing that letter was, one, to provide that real, to send a message that we want the state to step up. We want the state to take this action and to have us all moving together in addressing these challenges. And so by adding that weight, I need our Seattle state delegation to know that we have their back. We know that advocating for progressive revenue can be at times politically risky, to be really candid about it. And so really sending that signal to say, no, we need to move in this direction, again, for the sake of services that many of our most vulnerable residents depend on. Yeah. That was why I signed that letter, because an all cuts budget would be devastating for too many across the state. And I care about our residents, and I care about residents across the entire state, and it's time that we all move together on this.
Councilmember Strauss, your thoughts about this letter? Why'd you sign it?
I mean, beyond everything else, cities are capped at raising their property tax 1% every year.
Big deal, yep.
And I signed this letter not just for the city of Seattle. I signed this for the 281 other cities and towns in this state, because when property tax is capped at 1%, that means that the revenue coming into the city is not meeting the same rate as inflation. So when residents are asking, why am I paying more and getting less, it's because they are in fact paying more, because every year it's going to go up.
Yeah.
But they are getting less because they are not paying the same amount of money that it takes to keep the services up.
Got it.
And so if somebody is paying more and getting more,
yeah,
they're going to be better served.
I understand.
Right. And so when we look at this, it's across the state. There's cities across the state right now that have not been able to raise their revenues to keep up with inflation over the course of a decade or more, and are really suffering. And we really need to be able to at least meet inflation. 3% is not going to meet inflation.
Yeah.
And it's not also saying that cities must increase it, because here in the city of Seattle, our voters have supported levy after levy after levy.
Right.
And so that is a way that we have been able to mitigate against a 1% cap.
I see.
And still deliver services to Seattleites.
Okay.
And we don't see there are cities just to the north of us that rejected a sales tax increase for public safety.
Right.
Right? I signed this letter because it's not just Seattle, it's many cities that are struggling.
Thank you for that. And we'll keep an eye out on House Bill 1334 with regard to that property tax measure. That's going to be a big one for the legislature. Councilmember Rinck, I want to move on to another challenging situation for the city. With Seattle City Light, there was a 2-year outside investigation that has been finally made public. It shows dozens of frontline workers have been drinking on the job, even stocking their city trucks with booze. The report also showed a pattern of sexual harassment, including groping, sexual advances from superiors, and pornography at work. City Light CEO Dawn Lindell spoke to the council about this situation, and how she's going to handle it.
What I want you to know is that we are addressing this situation head on, with directness and accountability. It's not a gray area situation to me, nor will it be going forward.
Councilmember Rinck, you chair the committee that oversees City Light. You said during the proceedings you were horrified by the findings of this investigation. Are you confident that City Light can clean up its act? Because it appears complaints similar to this have been coming into this agency for many years.
Yeah, certainly. I share a number of the concerns that I imagine the community has about what is our path forward. And I would state that it is going to be the role of my committee to be providing that oversight to City Light leadership to make sure they're delivering on culture change and providing that oversight to make sure that the HR protocols in place to ensure accountability are working. And so I'll be working alongside General Manager Lindell as we're navigating this time, but we're going to have to see some results first. And I would voice again.
Meaning people need to get fired, or what are we talking about here?
I know Councilmember Moore and I have been talking about some kind of actionable deliverable that City Light can provide in terms of a path forward, in terms of how they're addressing culture change. We're going to have to work on it, and we're going to have to revisit this topic often because the culture that has been perpetuated is entirely unacceptable. Entirely unacceptable, the kind of behavior that we've seen. And so while I came out of committee last week feeling and seeing City Light leadership handle this with the level of seriousness that I think it really requires, I know we are going to have to work alongside and continue to monitor the situation.
Yeah, and looking at this, Councilmember Strauss, you're a member of this committee too. I was just really struck by the fact that this investigation took 2 years to complete because in many cases, employees were too scared to come forward, I guess, and had to be approached several times by this investigator just to do an interview. I guess I was looking at this point of how long do you expect it to take for what sounds like a system-wide culture change at City Light?
You know, I don't have a timeline, but my rage was suppressed on the dais. My rage is suppressed with you here, and even in the executive sessions leading up to this. I was unequivocal in my direction that anyone engaging in this behavior should not be employed by the City of Seattle. Of course, investigations have to take place, and of course, findings have to, conclusions have to be found. And oftentimes, this is a system that's set up on making survivors expose themselves and tell their story. Survivors are oftentimes the ones that have everything to lose and nothing to gain. Because if they come out with their experience and they receive, because the threats that were reported is that folks would receive poor work performances. They wouldn't be given the schedules that they preferred that worked for their families.
Right.
So many other things. So if a survivor is not going to be believed, or the survivor is not going to have the investigation followed up with, and they come forward, then they have poor performance reviews, bad work schedules, bullying, intimidation, and predation at the workplace. And so they've got everything to lose and nothing to gain necessarily. And so and those were the line, that was the line of my questioning at committee, was how are we going to ensure that these folks know that it is safe and show through action that it is safe for them to come forward. Because them coming forward, unfortunately, is the foundation to substantiating these allegations. And if anyone in the City of Seattle is sexually harassing, sexually assaulting, engaging in this predatory or bullying behavior, they have no place working in our city.
Got it. Thank you. And please.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention, at the time of this filming, again, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And the city just brought forward a proclamation addressing this. So the cruel irony of this situation, and I know as a women leader at this city, it is a goal of mine to just ensure that Seattle's the best employer of the city, but that it's a safe place for women to work. And so, again, I am horrified by the findings of this, and I'll be taking every possible step I can to be providing that oversight and accountability because this cannot continue.
Thank you. I have another challenging issue I'd love to wrap up with you if I could here, because you and Councilmember Strauss were on the no side of a bill that passed 6-3 a couple weeks ago to build affordable housing in the SODO area, a maker's district, as it's been called, near T-Mobile Park. It's a very contentious issue for the council. I know you're aware of this. As of mid-April, the Port of Seattle has filed a land use appeal in King County Superior Court in an attempt to overturn the council's decision. I know, Councilmember Rinck, you had some concerns about how this legislation came forward, maybe some concerns about how the council president did this. What do you want to say about how this went down?
Thank you for that question. I was critical of the process from the beginning when this legislation was directed not to the Land Use Committee, of which I'm a member of, but rather to the Governance and Accountability Committee instead. And I was critical of the process throughout. When we saw a tilted table where some perspectives were heard at the beginning, we saw some of that remedied by bringing the partners at the port together. But what I would say in this moment is what's clear was that there remains a lot of hurt between the various partners in this project. And I think still a lot of outstanding confusion. And what I walk away from this is this this real feeling of it didn't have to be this way if we took our time, if we really brought people to the table to come forward with a compromise, with something that could work for everybody. That's something that I was working to shepherd in the days leading up to the vote. And so coming into this moment, I know I remain committed to working to support zoning changes that allow for more housing across the city. That's something my office is committed to, especially as we're looking to stand up and ensure that the social housing developer is able to deliver on union-built social housing.
We got a comprehensive plan to worry about too. Yeah, keep going.
And we're gonna focus on all of those opportunities. But I think my main takeaway from the SODO vote is it didn't have to be that way. And certainly, we will see how things hash out with the lawsuit filed by the Port of Seattle. I worry about our relationship with our port partners, especially during this time of economic uncertainty and a trade war. And so I walk away from this really committed to building back those partnerships and making sure that, again, we're working together, because we are going to be weathering some really uncertain times ahead of us.
Agreed. Councilmember Strauss, some thoughts about this? I know you had some concerns going forward with this. I saw it on the dais there, and I wanted to get your take on what happened here.
I'm going to ground us with, we were just talking about the budget and the budget negative projections that are coming forward, and sales and use tax, and how construction increased our sales tax revenue that the city relied on. 1/3 of our sales and use tax is from port-related activities. So we've had a downturn in construction. We're now relying on the foundational elements of our sales and use tax. And 1/3 of that are port-related activities. Port activities sometimes seem sleepy as you're driving by, because all you see are containers, or all you see is a ship. You don't see the containers moving, you don't see the ships moving. You see things just kind of stagnant all the time. But they're not actually stagnant, they're moving quite quickly, and they're making a lot of revenue for our city. And protecting the ability to get cargo off of a ship and onto I-90 or I-5 is the basis for ensuring that our port is able to weather any storm that we come to.
Okay.
The 2023 agreement that I helped shepherd and pass was an agreement that took years of stakeholder work to build consensus and to repair harm that had been done to relationships between landowners and industrial businesses, because there had been a tension since 2007, when the most recent industrial zoning changes had occurred. There was such friction amongst those stakeholders that we brought in a facilitator to have a facilitated conversation that led to the 2023 agreement, with the understanding that putting housing in SODO was the one thing we couldn't find agreement on. And so additional compromises were made. We expanded the amount of office space in SODO around the light rail station, and we included more hotels than originally expected in the SODO area. And so we can currently today build 3 hotels around the stadiums.
Right.
And I come back to this point.
Please.
That project that they're proposing with the maker space and then the housing units above, if those housing units were a hotel, they could build that project without changing the law. And that only came out at that last meeting. And so it goes back to me again for process, because had we had more time to understand for colleagues to understand what the agreement was in 2023, why and how we got there, and the implications for the decision that they were making right now, I think we'd see a different vote. But the process was rushed. It was not sent to the Land Use Committee. It was unfortunate.
And I hate to rush our time here, but we are finished here. A big thanks to Councilmember Dan Strauss, Councilmember Alexis Mercedes Rinck. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And we will see you next time on City Inside Out Council Edition.